Hey everybody, this is class number 10, and as you can see, my handwriting gets worse every single week. There's lots of material, a lot of material today. If you feel like you need to pause it halfway, feel free to do that. I promise you it'll be worth it. After all, you paid no money, right? This is free. The only thing that is that you're paying is with your time, and I'm hoping to make it worth it. Today we're talking about self-awareness and intentionality. It's one of those things I don't know that we really talk about too much in the church, but man, it's in the Bible a lot. It's not always so explicit. It's not something that people talk a lot about. But that's why we're here. This is a spiritual discipline. And so with that, let's get on it. Let's start with, self-awareness here. I mean, spiritual discipline requires self-awareness. If you don't know what you're working on, you're not going to work on it, right? The Bible actually has a word for people without self-awareness. They call them, or the Bible calls them, fools. That's the technical term. Actually, in Proverbs, when you look at it, it talks about wise people, fools, and another category called evil people, right? We're talking about fools. These are people who are just flailing around aimlessly, not people who intentionally do wrong. And we can certainly be that. In fact, everyone used to be a fool because everyone used to be a child. And there's all kinds of scriptures about fools in the Bible. Some of them actually quite hilarious. All right? I would actually ask you, go ahead and search. Do a little Google search. Just type in Bible and fools. And you will see quite a few good scriptures. Let me just read a few real quick. Wisdom is found on the lips of the discerning, but a rod is for the back of the one who has no sense. The wise store up knowledge, but the mouth of a fool invites ruin. The lips of fools bring them strife, and their mouths invite a beating. You probably know someone like that, don't you? All hard work brings a profit, but mere talk leads only to poverty. The plans of the diligent lead to profit as surely as haste leads to poverty. So, and if you go look, there's probably, 50, 60 more. Proverbs talks about fools all the time. And once again, what are fools? People who lack intentionality and they lack self-awareness. They're not diligent. They're not focused. They don't perceive what's going on in here. And so they keep inviting a beating, sometimes just to themselves. They bring it on themselves all the time. Right? This is daytime television, right? Daytime television is television perhaps for fools, but certainly about fools, right? Just go watch any court TV show. Just go watch any kind of soap opera. I mean, fools, fools, fools. And I'm not disparaging them. I'm bringing hopefully some attention to this so that we can become less foolish. That's my goal here. Grow up. I know that's usually an insult when it's used, but it's our goal, right? Children are fools. They're intelligent, right? But they're not fully functioning. They're not self-aware. They do quite a few things that we might find hilarious and charming. But if they were to continue into, say, my age, depressing and horrible, right? I love this quote from Dave Ramsey. He says that children do what feels good, but adults devise a plan and they follow through. That's what distinguishes an adult from a child and a fool from a non-fool. Maturity is something that takes intentional effort. It's not something that's just going to happen as you get older. In fact, some of the saddest examples of humanity are people who get into their 50s and 60s and 70s and just stopped growing around their teens or 20s or 30s. Like they haven't grown. Been doing the same old thing for decades. And it can be very, very sad. And one of the ways that we can distinguish about if we're becoming a fool is how we react. Something we should do if we're going to aim towards self-awareness and intentionality is to become less reactive. If you notice the people that are the more measured speakers, the ones that can control their reactions and seem to have a good answer to anyone who asks, these are the people we look up to. These are the people that we kind of admire. You know, they don't just let words come out of their mouth. They're not just flailing around. They're not just making decisions. They are thoughtful in their approach, and they're thoughtful in their speech. And the Bible praises that heavily, praises it heavily. Something to aspire to. How do you be self-aware? I think one of the things that we all need to know, for instance, is that we are not unified. And what I mean by that is that human beings are not just one thing. And we know that because we're based on God. And God is not one thing. God is a trinity. God is both Father, Son, and Spirit. And there are many ways of categorizing this, but the most common one to say is that the Bible describes the human beings as having a soul, or there being a soul there, and a spirit, and a body. And I know there's a lot of debate around that, but just functionally speaking, let's all say for argument's sake, hey, we're not all unified. And you know this. Go read Romans 7. Romans 7 talks about warring against ourselves, just having competing desires, having almost self-sabotaging and struggling with sin, right? And that's because we have one thing that desires one thing and another thing that desires another thing, and it's like they're fighting. And you can even conceptualize these as different personalities. These are different parts of you that are competing for attention and competing for dominance, right? And the one who is not self-aware just acts that out and just says, well, I guess I was dumb. Let's aim to be a little bit more than that, right? I like this quote. It's attributed to C.S. Lewis, but he probably didn't say it, but I like it anyway. It says that you don't have a soul, you are a soul, you have a body. I like this. This goes along with the second quote. It's actually from Eckhart Tolle, which is he's not a Christian, but he's a spiritualist, but I think he's on point here. What he talks about is that you are not your thoughts, and you are not your emotions. You are the one that notices your thoughts and emotions, which I think is really helpful. It's very helpful language to help us understand what it's like to be one of these. It's that I have thoughts, I have emotions, but those don't dominate me. They don't control me. They are not me. I am the one who notices these things, right? And how do I notice these things? Usually by meditation, self-awareness, by growing a little bit, by learning a little bit more, by being conscious of myself. That's how you do it. And the more you do it, the more in control you are of these things, right? We also have a wonderful scripture in 2 Corinthians 10, verse 5 that's talking about taking captive of every emotion. Taking captive of every thought. And we know from Paul, he did this. That man was super productive. Even in his writings. I mean, just print off one of his small books, right? It's probably this big in text, right? And people can spend decades trying to understand it. He packed so much information in those little books of his that they're now in our Bible, and people literally spend years and decades and lifetimes trying to understand what he's saying and mining it for gold, right? You don't do that without being unintentional. You don't. You don't become a complex, wonderful, profound, directed human being by accident. It happens by discipline. And if Paul did it and he's aspiring to do it, we should as well. He is one of our apostles, right? Let's go ahead and do something real quick, though. If we're interested in gaining self-awareness, let's do an experiment. I actually have a few experiments. They're all in purple here. So as I say a few things, go ahead and ask yourself, what's your gut reaction? How do you feel? Rush Limbaugh, transgender, Trump, Biden, feminism, white supremacy, Muslim, atheist. It's just a small list, kind of a trigger list, if you will. But here's my question is, when I said those words, or if you encounter these phenomena or these kinds of people or these ideas, what happens to you immediately? Do you get a gut punch? And then when you feel that way, how does that change the way that you act? Are you conscious of the way that it changes how you act, right? Some of these things are very hot button and they feel immediately like a threat. And I'm here to say we should pay attention to that, because if we're merely acting out our fear, that is not biblical at all. There's not a single moment in the Bible, for instance, when you see a Christian who is at their best doing that. And Jesus, who was our model, could have reacted in numerous ways, and he didn't. He was very measured in his action, thoughtful in his speech. In fact, he's almost like a philosopher, or someone who is just crafting his words. And once again, Jesus, in terms of his self-awareness and intentionality, I haven't stopped listening to and reading the Sermon on the Mount since I was a young boy, and I'm still learning from it. That's just the intentionality and the impact of those words, those Holy Spirit guided words, right? You don't get that by accident. You don't get that by just reacting. I would submit to us that we would do well if we strive to not overreact and to not react quickly. And I think that we will be rewarded by doing so. We have to be weathering the changing times. The world is changing at a greater rate than it ever has before, and that is accelerated by the easy access of information, as well as how much the cultures are colliding. Right? There's never been a period of time where this has happened more than it is now, and it's probably just going to accelerate. And especially for the people that are older, that are experiencing this, can be very threatening and confusing. And I would say that we should pay attention to this and try to really work through this intentionally. Especially social media and news, what it seems to be doing is it gives a false sense of urgency. Like it throws something in your face, this little push notifications, and you click on your phone and here's this story, and here's this story, and here's this story. And it's just a barrage. Right? And it all feels so urgent, like, it's happening to me. It's happening to me. What do I need to do about it? I can't do anything. Right? And I would say this is a false narrative. Because if you just shut off those devices and live for a little bit, you wouldn't feel like you need to do anything, and you would pay attention to your neighbor more than your phone. Right? I think it's false. I think it's misleading. You can even look at documentaries like, I think, The Social Experiment, I think that's what it's called, where it talks about how they have algorithms that are designed to feed you more of what you're going to click on, and the things that you tend to click on usually have to do with either lust or fear, two of the more basic human emotions. Do you want to be controlled by that? Perhaps get away from your phone for a bit. Right? It's a false sense of urgency. And having some self-awareness about that is great, because these phones, as amazing as they are, they take away your intentionality. Let me ask you something. Just think for a moment. Here's another experiment. How do you feel after you've been on Facebook? How do you feel after you've checked the news? How do you feel? How do you feel? How do you feel when you go on to the news programs? How do you feel when you go on Instagram, Pinterest, right? Before getting on there, just ask yourself, how do you usually feel when you get done with that? Is it good feeling? Do you feel refreshed? Do you feel entertained? Or do you just kind of feel kind of hopeless? Do you feel irritated? Do you feel a sense of community? How do you feel? I would ask you, especially if the answer is something negative over here, take a break. Take a week-long break, right? So that you can gain perspective and self-awareness. You probably don't even know how you're reacting. It's possible. Well, take a week-long break away from social media and the news. Take a whole week. Just none of that, right? See what happens to your body. See what happens to your soul. See what happens to your mind and your emotions. I've had several people do this, and the results are better than expected, actually. People that would say, it doesn't bother me that much. Or they'll say things like, well, I need to stay informed. Why? Why do you need to stay informed? I understand the importance in concept, but who is informing you, and who is putting all that information in front of your eyeballs? Is it possible that they're lying to you? Is it possible that they're giving you a spin that you already agree with because you clicked on 13 other things that looked like that before, and they're feeding you more of the same just to get you outraged and riled up? Is it possible? And more importantly, what are you going to do with this information? You get one vote, right? You get one vote every so often. Another one's coming soon. You get to talk to your neighbors. What do you get to do? Maybe you get to take some action on some of these. Great, then do that. Do some good in the world. But if you're not doing that, if you're just sitting down in a room and consuming and getting outraged, how is that glorifying God? How is that bringing about the kingdom? I'll ask you that. This is self-awareness, right? What are you doing? Does a comment on Facebook change heart and lives? Maybe it can, a really thoughtful one. But when's the last time it's changed your life? That you went on Facebook and you're like, oh, that was awesome. When's the last time that happened? Just a question. I would ask you that you use statistics to gain a perspective. It's interesting that generally speaking, because of our prosperity, things are actually getting a lot better, practically speaking. The crime rate has gone down significantly. Global poverty rate has gone down. There's a lot more freedoms. We have it better than Solomon had it. But from the words of some Christians, you would think that the end times are upon us and we're about to die right now. Right? A lot of doom and gloom. And I understand it, it's confusing and everything's changing so quickly. And we are moving away from religion. Right? We are, generally speaking, we're either moving away from religion, or maybe those people weren't all that religious in the first place. And we're just finding that it's a lot easier to not go to church because it's not expected anymore. It's very possible. I like the idea of using statistics, simply because I know that, for instance, every plane crash is going to get press. So we perceive that there's more than average, right? Every time a daycare seems to have a problem, have you noticed? Every time a daycare has problems, it's going to make the news, right? It might give us the impression that daycares are not safe, but we know if they weren't safe, they wouldn't be legal, or they'd be much more heavily regulated. There's a lot of things that the news picks up on that they know that you're going to pay attention to, and so it puts more in front of everybody's faces. And statistics is a way of reining in, how actually dangerous is this thing. COVID's a good example. It's a very hard thing to quantify for a lot of people. I would ask you to go look at the rates lately and see how they're dropping down and make thoughtful decisions about what an acceptable risk is. Be aware of how you feel. When I even say the word COVID, or wearing a mask, right? Once again, how does that make you feel, and how does that change the way you act when you see somebody who's wearing a mask or not wearing a mask, or is getting a vaccine or is not getting a vaccine? Let's ask a different question, how are we going to bring about the kingdom of God through our conversations with these people? Is that our standard? Or are we more interested in being right or justified? It's for you to decide, right? I'm here to bring up the conversation. I love the words of Gamaliel when we talked about weathering the changing times. If you remember, Gamaliel said in the beginning of Acts, in regards to the Christian movement, if I can quote, he said, do you remember Theudas, who said he was something, and then he died, and then he amounted to nothing? And remember this other guy who also claimed that he was the Messiah, and he was challenged, and his followers scattered, and now we don't even hear about him, right? And then he says this about Jesus, and his followers. He says, if it is not from God, it will pass away and amount to nothing. But if it is from God, even what you do, you will not be able to stand against it. Once again, if it's not from God, it will go away on its own. If it is from God, even if you stand against it, you won't be able to, because it will be stronger than you. You'll be fighting God himself. I don't know how applicable that is, but that's something I think about when I think about all of the changing things that are happening in culture. And you can look back at the last 200 years and see all the stupid stuff we used to do that we don't do now because the evidence is in, the data is in. We have much more evidence and much more intelligence. Maybe not more wisdom, but at least we know more. And that should be maybe something that guides us and helps us feel calm. Like even if we mess up as a culture, that there will be a chance for redemption later on. Let's keep our even keel mentality. Let's keep our long-term perspective. You look at the history of Israel and you think, man, like at certain points in their life, in the history of Israel, it seemed rather hopeless, right? Just like maybe it does now for some of the people who are listening to this, it might seem hopeless. Like, what's going on here? But we all know that what Israel eventually did was birth the Messiah, right? And if you take the highs and lows as, more than it needs to be, and not look at the long-term perspective of history, you're likely to get caught up too much and get fearful or just relaxed. Let's not do that. Let's have a long-term perspective on things. We're just like grass. We're like chaff. Like we're here today and gone tomorrow. And good things will happen and bad things will happen. And that's just called humanity. That's just called life. That's just called existence. Right? Good things happen and then bad things happen. And then you know what happens after the bad things? The good things happen. Right? Not always at the same time, not always in direct proportion to each other. But let's weather that. Let's weather that. Right? The world is not about to explode in a flaming ball of fire. And you know what? If it does, we get to see Jesus. I'd call it a win-win. Right? We are called to be what is called the salt of the earth and the light of the world. And when I think about that, I think it's a challenge to be individually responsible for portraying a Christian worldview. Two of the hottest, most difficult things, actually maybe three, that we're dealing with in the current culture today is sexuality, it's gender, and it's race. Right? It's very hot button, highly decided. I don't know that you could point to a single human being and go, well, they got it all figured out. Right? Because we'd probably follow that person, maybe. Or we'd ignore them like we ignored Jesus. Right? We would. My issue in bringing this up is that the Bible calls us the light of the world, but it also says, what happens when you no longer show light? And what happens if you're the salt of the earth and you no longer are salty? This is about our essence, right? In issues of race and gender and sexuality, which I think are some of the hardest, they're just difficult. I would submit to you that our goal as the church is to figure this out for ourselves, live it out, whatever the successful version of that is, and then show it to the world. If we have not, as the church, lived out what godly sexuality looks like, what godly, gender identity looks like, what godly diversity looks like, if we have not lived that out, if we can't show them what it means and what it looks like, how are we supposed to have a witness? It's not enough to just go, well, this book over here that we read says this. No. Not enough. We need to live it out and then show people. And I think to our discredit, I don't think the church has always done a very good job of it. And you would know. Just go ask anybody out in the community and say, hey, can you show me, or think about a good example of somebody who is grappling with gender in a high-level way, who is Christian, who is really excelling at that. Find somebody. Find somebody who can navigate as something as difficult as sexuality, right? I actually know a few examples in this case, right? But they're not prominent. They're certainly not, maybe well-examined and something we could hold up. I say this to say, man, we need to have some humility about some of these high-level problems and some self-awareness and not be so reactive when some of these things come up, right? Humility is part of what keeps us not, stuck and just without opinions, but it's what keeps us thoughtful and helpful and imaging Christ the best way we can. Because some of these problems are just very, very difficult to solve. They are. And if we don't admit that, if we just boil everything down to a few talking points and a couple scriptures and just don't want to deal with it, so we just don't even think about it, all right, I think it's damaging our witness. I think it is. Let's move on to intentionality. Let me ask you, this is a tough question. How much time do you waste? How much time do you waste? All right, the answer is probably a lot. I mean, let's be honest. I know I waste a lot of time. Let me give you an example. I was just at the gas station getting my oil changed the other day, and I watched the lady. I watched the lady at the gas station counter. She had basically the same conversation every single day, just this small talk. And I remember them talking about what Biden and the Keystone Pipeline and the weather and like, gosh. And she would just, I was there for about an hour and I heard her have the same conversation basically 3 or 4 times. And it just got me thinking, because I was preparing this lesson. I was thinking, gosh, like, how intentional is that? I know I've been this way, especially in my 20s. It's like, oh, let's just talk about the weather. That's something that's always happening, right? And I think there's even a part in the Bible that I couldn't find it, but man, I think there's a part in the Bible that talks about, you guys talk about the weather all the time, but you don't perceive, you can't even perceive the changing of the times, the end times. You can't perceive the changing. You're busy talking about the weather. That's going to happen. The weather has been the weather since there's been the weather. It has. What are you talking about? Are you talking about the kingdom? Are you talking about things that matter? Or just what's accessible, what's easy, what's natural, what's, convenient? Just a challenge there. It's almost like at the gas station that the theme of each conversation was, hey, let's get irritated together and then feel right. Okay. Okay. I ask you, what value is that? All right. What value is to just be irritated at something together? Do you think the people that are engaged in those conversations get something out of it? They feel anything good about this? Or is it more they just kind of like more bitter and crabby, and then they move on with their day, and then they go to the next conversation where they're bitter and crabby, and then they move on their day? This stands in direct opposition to the week of encouragement, which I asked you all to do a while ago, right? And in fact, why don't you try this experiment? Maybe not do this, but just imagine doing it. Well, and frankly, maybe there's some people that you know, or it could even be you, that just do this anyway all day, right? Just go look at the news and look at the local politics, and every single person you meet, just go talk to them about it. Ask yourself at the end of the day and after every interaction, how did you feel after doing that? Was it just warm inside? Did you have a better outlook on life, or did it just kind of get in there and like a bitterness and a hopelessness sink in? I ask you, feel free to try it. I'd love if anybody tries it. Please, leave a comment in the description. I'd love to see it. Matthew 12 says, "You will give an account for every idle word." And I don't think that's just mere sophistry. There's many parts in the Bible that talk about how unintentionality is a sin. And actually, even the word hamartia, the word that we use for sin, means to miss the mark. It means to be unintentional. It means to be off target, right? Most of sin is that. It's like we're just missing the mark. We're not being thoughtful. We're not correcting ourselves. We might remember the parable of the talents. The person that got punished was not somebody who just committed some grand sin. He didn't do anything wrong necessarily. What he did was nothing. He just kind of took his bag of money and just buried it. Well, think about this. Your tongue, your mouth, your words, they are powerful beyond belief. They're powerful beyond the belief. What are you doing with them? What are you doing with your words? Are you burying them in the ground? Are you just throwing them out there like it's worthless and meaningless? Or are you using your speech to build up people and be the salt of the earth and the light of the world? Are you? All right. 1 Timothy 5:11-14 talks about gossips and busybodies. It was a big problem in the church over there. And, was even a reason? for an entire letter, the first letter, the letter of First Timothy, was probably about a couple or a group of women who were fighting, and women who were gossips and busybodies. Ephesians 5:4 talks about no crude jesting or unwholesome talk. Don't let it fall out of your mouth. Right? And I could give you probably 20 more scriptures about, hey, stay on point. Don't let nasty words fall out of your mouth. Use your speech for good, not for evil. Be intentional. Pursue the kingdom of God. Aim at that. Right? This is all about intentionality. Right? Let's be directed and purposed in our life. Romans 12 is probably the best one that I could come up with this time, because Romans 12 talks about living and loving among diverse opinions and diverse people and diverse belief systems. That's hard. That was actually the biggest obstacle of the church early on. Christianity started from a bunch of Jewish people who broke apart from Judaism and then needed to somehow harmonize. And then they went into Greece, and then they went into Rome, and they had to bring something. They had to bring the gospel to all of these people and find different ways of communicating and find different ways of interacting and tolerating and speaking with. And right? It's no different today. It's just now it's at your doorstep. You don't have to go to somebody. They're coming to you, and that might seem threatening. But I would encourage you. This scripture applies to you. Romans 12 gives a lot of great points. Talks about renewing your mind, making it anew. You might have some belief systems that just frankly need to die. They no longer serve you or anybody else. And how do you know if they need to die? You challenge them. You think about it. You interrogate those thoughts. Right? You need to renew your mind. Transform it. Have some humility. Here's the question that's a little uncomfortable. How do you know what you know? It's really hard. I know myself as a teacher, I have to answer this all the time, because whenever I teach something, am I just teaching it because it sounds nice or just because I think it? And then if somebody were to challenge me, could I defend that? And if I answer no, I don't teach that, or at least I strive not to teach anything like that, because it means it's not well thought up enough. Keep your spiritual fervor. This is the idea of, it's a Greek word, zeontes, which comes from the word zoe, meaning spiritual life, meaning like, let's be full of spiritual life. And I believe that's directed spiritual life. This is something that helps us navigate. People who are positive thinking, people who are encouraging, people who are humble, they're usually great to be around. And the great thing about them is they can be around anybody, not just the people that think and act and look like them, but they can be around anybody. That is something we should all strive to be, is someone who can befriend anybody. Anybody. Verse 14 talks about blessing those who persecute you, right? It's pretty important. I know our culture seems to really hold up Martin Luther King pretty highly, and for good reason. He did so many good things, and his idea of non-aggressive peacekeeping, nonviolent protesting, was quite effective, actually. I would love if we could embrace that on a daily basis. Right, especially if anyone who holds up Martin Luther King to be someone worth emulating or following, well, do you follow the same principles? If there's something going on in the school system, are you out there for blood, or are you blessing those who persecute you? Right? Are you praying for your enemies? These are hard scriptures. Right? We can be a little angry inside when something's happening that we disagree with and we see something bad happening, but how are we messaging that? In our very messages, are we honoring Christ, or are we just reacting? Are we just, out for blood, or are we thirsting for some sort of vindication? Are we using political power in an attempt to coerce somebody into doing something or not doing something? I can't justify that biblically, that's for sure. We're supposed to love our enemies. We're supposed to bless those who persecute us. I don't think this means that we're nice and quiet. I don't think it means that. I think it means we're thoughtful, we're self-aware, we're intentional, and we use our speech for good. And we stand up for what we believe in appropriate ways. Right? Live in harmony. It says verse 16. And go hang out with low status people. That's basically what it says. People that are, below you in the social chain, or that don't look like you. Go live with them. Go be among them. It's part of how you change. It's part of how you grow. Just like I mentioned there before, with diversity and sexuality and gender. Go get some friends that struggle with these things or that are part of these different communities. Go get some friends. Meet them. They're real people. They are real people that image God. They are God's children. And just like you and me. And the more that you get to know them, the more that you can struggle with them rather than attempt to be their judge, which, of course, we're called not to be. That's hard to ask, sure, but be open to it. I think you'll find that you won't grow, that you will grow more in communing with people that don't think like you and believe like you than you'll ever grow anywhere else. Go talk to an atheist about religion and try to answer their hard questions. I dare you. Go try. See how much they call you on how much you really didn't think through your faith. And don't be afraid, right? God's with you, and it'll make you stronger. Just be open-minded. This is part of what I've had to do, I think, my entire life, and it's been helpful. It's part of why I bring up things like atheism and Buddhism, and, it's fine for you to believe something, but have you believed something but also considered the options? Because if you haven't, you're going to get defensive when somebody brings up something that's different than you. And I would much rather have anyone listening here believe because it's the best option and you've fought for it. You've wrestled with God, right? You've wrestled with truth and reality, and the thing that was going to win came up on top, and you own it. You own that knowledge. It isn't just something you learned in church camp 12 years ago that now you can parrot, because you'll find out how weak that is when you find somebody with a really good argument against it. And this living in harmony, get a better argument, or at least strive to. And until you do, try not to judge or speak evil. In fact, how we overcome evil, as stated in verse 21, is we overcome evil with good. And I would define good as positive intent, thoughtful speech, and action. Right? So how do we become more intentional? I think you parent yourself. It's like the Dave Ramsey quote, children do what feels good. Adults devise a plan and follow through. You're still a child to some degree. You know it. I know it. I definitely have some childlike parts that need some parenting. And I don't always want to parent them. I don't always want to be the adult. But I like this idea of, where am I a child? Where am I Peter Panning in the world? And when does it take a parent to come alongside and go, hey, no, you're acting like a child. You're not thinking this through. You're avoiding this. You're making snap judgments. You're not taking every thought captive. You're not renewing your mind. All right? Qualify everyone who speaks into your life. Not everybody gets to talk to you and have opinions and influence you. You should interview these people and qualify them and make sure that they're good enough people. Don't just get opinions from everybody. Don't just go out in the world and have fights with people and then they fight you back. Actually, one of the major points of a fool is that they fight with everybody. Once again, their mouth invites a beating. Right? I even have this thing called the car key test. Car key test is a way to find out who's trustworthy, who are confident. And it's not perfect, but the idea is, if I would lend you my car, if I would give you my car keys, it means you can also hold my secrets, my vulnerabilities, my private moments. You can probably handle that too. And I would not tell anything to anyone that's vulnerable and personal if you wouldn't also lend them your car and expect that they'll give it back. Because what happens when you give them information? Just like what happens if you give them car keys. And then maybe they give it to somebody else. And then that person gives it to somebody else. And pretty soon your car is just floating around the community and you have no control over it, no power. Word to the wise, this is social media. Right? I wouldn't say anything you wouldn't want used against you in social media. It's just not worth it. All right? Let's be thoughtful and diligent in our speech. And lastly, and this is another bit of an experiment, take a look at your week. You know, there's 168 hours in a week. 168 hours. If you're doing something important, it should show up. It should show up. Take a look at some of the things you do, especially the things that are unintentional and potentially wasteful. And I would ask you, what percentage of your week does it take up? Screen time is an easy one because the phone actually tracks it, right? Go find out how many hours you had for screen time and tablet time and all that. And then divide that number by 168, right? And then ask yourself, okay, if I spend 10% of my time even, which would be 16.8 hours, how much time am I spending on my marriage? How much time am I spending on reading good, thoughtful books and learning about myself? How much time am I spending in prayer and meditation? How much time am I spending loving and investing into people? All right? How much time am I spending working on my career compared to screen time and all these other things that can so easily take away our time? Divide that by 168. I know the researcher Gottman talks about how you should spend at least 5 hours on your marriage. 5 divided by 168 is about 2%. Right? Gottman is saying spend 2% of your week on your marriage, which I would submit for those that are married is the most important thing in their life. Because if it crumbled, everything else becomes a lot less meaningful. Well, I know this is a really heady and kind of long class, but thank you for tolerating and putting up with it. I hope it's been helpful. I would ask you, try these different thought experiments that I have listed here. And please review them, put them in the comments. I would love some engagement on this. And if you think I'm wrong, tell me, because I would love to be right. God bless you, and I hope you have a good week. Take care.